Welcome to Akathisia Stories, a podcast from MIST, the Medication-Induced Suicide Prevention and Education Foundation in Memory of Stewart Dolin. MIST is a nonprofit dedicated to raising awareness about akathisia, a medication-induced disorder that can cause suicide, self-harm, and violence. Our mission is simple: increase education and save lives.
So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Akathisia Stories podcast. I'm your host, Ivan Kaiser, and today I had the pleasure of sitting down with Katinka Blackford Newman. Katinka is a journalist and former award-winning TV documentary filmmaker based in the UK. Her book, The Pill That Steals Lives, was praised by psychopharmacologist and author Dr. David Healy. You can watch the documentary of the same name on her Vimeo, but also if you go to our website, mist.co, and take our free Akathisia 101 course, you can see her documentary in full, kind of presented as like a case study on the course. So that's a collaboration that we're happy to have with Katinka. She's a life coach and hosts a podcast, the Med Free Mental Fitness channel on YouTube. So we'll put links to that below. You can go check that out. But before we get into Katinka's personal life and her work, one of the main reasons we're doing this podcast today is to talk about Prescribed Harm Awareness Day, which is on July 29th, and what Katinka has planned for that day. So she's the co-founder of the website antidepressantrisks.org, which we'll also link below. But go check out the website, and she should have details on the event on the site. So, but Katinka, great for you to be with us today.
Lovely to be here, Ivan. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So before we get into your kind of personal story and everything that started back in 2012, can you kind of tell us a little bit about yourself? You know, what made you want to go into journalism and documentary filmmaking?
What made me want to go into filmmaking? Gosh, that's such a good question. I mean, it happened almost by accident, really. I studied theatre. I was always a good storyteller. I was always interested in telling stories. I'd had a challenging childhood, which probably made me more emotionally intelligent than most, more interested in human psychology. And so I'd studied theatre. And then I happened to get work experience at the BBC, I was working there for free. And then I ended up on an incredible television program, which was very, very well known in the UK, and it was called That's Life. And back in the day, it went out on Sunday evenings, and it had 20 million viewers. And it was basically it was on the BBC, and it was a consumer program. Basically, it was a consumer campaigning journalism program. So literally, laws would get changed overnight because we would put something on about, it could be anything. It could be bicycle helmets or something about transplants or whatever, and things would just change. Or schools got closed down because they were run by child abusers, and it was hosted by an incredible woman who has become a mentor. She's very well known in the UK, called Esther Rantzen, which is Dame Esther Rantzen. And I just was intoxicated by this idea of campaigning journalism and that you could change people's lives by telling people's stories. So that was the beginning for me. And then I was very inspired to then just move into documentaries. So I've always been interested in telling people's stories as a way to make change, to bring about change. So that's kind of, that's what I loved doing. I loved talking to people. I loved interviewing people. And that has really underpinned all of my filmmaking since. I was a really lousy news and current affairs journalist when I occasionally was plunged into that pool because issues, I just couldn't get my head around issues at all. I was like, I always wanted the human interest story. So that's where my talents lie. That's where my love lies. And I yes, I love telling people's stories, basically. And I think that's an exciting way to bring about change.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing in one of the other podcasts I listened to with you that you were really fascinated by kind of the underdog story, and definitely getting those real life perspectives. And I'm also very curious to hear how a lot of that approach to the research and preparation and stuff changed after you had, your life experience with antidepressants and everything. So for people who don't know, could you, I guess, take us back to 2012, I think it was, when you first took an antidepressant and you got kind of thrust into that whole experience, and tell us a bit about what that was like.
So yes, it was 2012. I was 47 at the time. And I was at the top of my game in terms of as a filmmaker. I had just come out of my marriage had broken down 8 months previously, and I was coping incredibly well. My husband had moved out. I was looking after our children who are age 11 and 12. I was juggling that with making films, traveling around the world, and life was kind of great. Life was, despite the fact that we'd had this difficult situation with the marriage breaking down, life was pretty good. What wasn't so good was that I had assumed that I would be keeping the marital home. I think that's probably what had been discussed at the time. And so when my ex said, actually, that's not going to happen, we're going to sell it so that we can both have, a reasonable home for the kids, I just went into a total spin, because I'd told the children that we wouldn't be moving out of this lovely neighborhood and this lovely home. So it was their loss. It was my loss. And I couldn't envisage a future somehow. I'd cope with everything by having a certain future in my head, which involved me living in this rather lovely big house with the 2 children. So it was kind of like, it just didn't add up in my head at all. And anyway, I couldn't sleep. I had some Zopiclone sleeping tablets for jet lag. I started taking those, and then I was just like, Christ, what am I going to do when these run out? This was after a few days, because I hadn't kind of dealt with the situation. They were not, I'm somebody who, as I discovered later, I'm somebody who doesn't react very well to any kind of medication. I think possibly the Zopiclone had made me slightly wobbly. But anyway, I went to the doctors to try and get more sleeping tablets. The doctor said no, or maybe gave me one or whatever. And I refused to accept that. We had private insurance. And so I went to a private psychiatrist. I said, I can't sleep. And can you give me something to sleep? And he said, well, I can't give you sleeping tablets. They're highly addictive, but you're depressed. You're obviously depressed. So I'm going to give you an antidepressant. And I remember thinking, this is very odd, because I wasn't depressed last week before I'd heard the news about selling the house. I was completely fine. But at the time I just thought, well, anyway, it doesn't really matter. He's giving me something that's going to help me to sleep. What do I care? So he gave me escitalopram, and I took it. I immediately had akathisia, which your listeners will know is an uncontrollable desire to keep moving. I didn't know it. And as a result of that, I literally didn't sleep and was in a terrible, terrible state. And after 2 days of that, I went into a complete toxic delirium and this was actually, so it was only after 3 doses of this pill. And
Wow.
And that was the most terrifying thing. I literally was hallucinating. I thought I had killed the children. I took a kitchen knife, and I stabbed myself and thought I'd stab the children. Again, this was partly, looking back, I remember in this delirium, this kind of feeling of akathisia as well. So it was all mixed up with hallucinations and so on and so forth. But certainly the uncontrollable desire to kind of harm myself and to stab myself with that knife would have been a kind of akathisia reaction. So my children, obviously, they were only aged 11 and 12 at the time. They called my ex. He came along, and my sister. They realized I was very ill. I was taken to a private hospital because of the insurance. I was delusional. They kept me in for a night. The next day, I was still delusional. I thought there were cameras in the ceiling. I wouldn't put the TV on because, and when people said, why not? I said, well, because there's going to be news footage of me because I've killed the children. So when they interviewed me, they were kind of like, she's completely crazy. She's got, psychotic depression, I think is what they thought. So the day after, because of course now I hadn't taken any more of the medication, the next day I woke up in the hospital and I was completely fine. And I was shocked. I didn't know what had happened. I hadn't really connected the dots to know that it was the escitalopram that had caused this. At the time, I thought, somebody must have put acid in my drink or something. I just couldn't understand it.
Yeah, and before you took that, did you have any hesitations about what would happen, or have any expectations? Like when he first prescribed it, you were just like, "Oh, I'll take this to help me sleep, and it'll be fine."
Yeah, I was naive. I was kind of desperate because I just wanted to sleep, because I had gone into this kind of catastrophizing of, oh God, if I can't sleep, I'm going to lose my job. If I lose my job, I won't be able to support the children. If I can't support the children, I won't, my ex will have custody. At that sort of that spiraling, that now I would have tools that would stop me from doing that. Back then, I didn't realize you don't have to jump onto every thought. Just because you think something, it's not true. You can kind of park that and you can have different thoughts. But at the time, it just seemed to be an inescapable spiral of thoughts that I was having, and a total overreaction to selling a house, basically, which is what it was. I mean, it was difficult, but it wasn't the end of the world. So anyway, there I was at this. I wake up, I'm completely fine. I ask if I can go home. They say absolutely not. And it would have all been fine, Ivan. It would have all been fine if they'd just said, okay, drink some water, stay here, do a bit of therapy, eat well, get better. It would have all been fine. But that isn't what happened. Of course, what they did is they said, right, you need antidepressants and antipsychotics. So
it's all just procedural. Yeah,
it's all procedural. And of course, if you react badly to one, you're going to probably react badly to all of them. These pills that act on the serotonin system, they're much of a muchness. If you have a kind of reaction to citalopram, you're going to have a reaction to Prozac, you're going to have a reaction to sertraline.
And you mentioned a little bit earlier on that, I think before you said you had some kind of genetic testing done. Of course, this is later on after the fact, and you found out that you were a low metabolizer, which of course at that time, if you would have no idea about that, then there's no idea what to expect, as in terms of reactions and whatnot. So
no, but also, I mean, it would have been extraordinary to me to think that a prescribed drug could have quite such a huge impact. It would have been, it's the only reason it's believable to me now is because I've experienced it. If anybody had have told me that at the time, I would have just said no. I would not have been able to believe it. But anyway, so there I was in the private hospital. Immediately, I started having akathisia again. I didn't go into a delirium, but that is what I had. And nobody recognized it. But I remember the agony of just not being, I was just walking round and round in circles. I was going up and down the corridor. I couldn't sit still in the therapy sessions, which of course they were like, oh, she's worse. she's really anxious because I couldn't sit down. And so the work that you're doing is so important, because I was in a top London hospital as a resident inpatient with unbelievably obvious, textbook akathisia. Absolutely nobody recognized it. They just put it down to anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know, again, this is skipping, forward about a year or so, but when you went back and you talked to that original doctor, I believe, right? And you told him, well, did you think that this could have been a possibility, that it could have been some kind of reaction? And what did he say? He was like, oh, that could have been a possibility. Yeah. But
Yeah,
I didn't consider it.
Much later on, when I was better and when I was writing my book, I decided to confront the doctor who is the main doctor. And actually, in fairness, halfway through, he did say something. He did notice that I had akathisia, but that was 6 months in. And it wasn't, oh, she's got akathisia, let's get her off all the drugs. It was like, she's got akathisia, let's switch drugs to something else that gives you akathisia.
But was that the first time you heard that word? So they use that word.
They did use that word. Yeah. Probably that was the first time that I've ever heard that word. But I mean, remember, I was so out of it.
Yeah.
Really, yeah, but I do remember that. I do remember that very moment, that moment, but it just caused him to go, oh, right, okay, let's up the Seroquel and down the, this. And it wasn't kind of like, oh my God, she's got akathisia, take her off everything. Just, let's, or, this is an emergency. It was just, let's give her more drugs that give her akathisia, was basically what he did. But yes, I did confront him, and he did admit that it was a possibility, that it was the drugs that had caused everything.
And I guess what really had saved you in a way was, kind of going back and forth with the story. So eventually you left the private hospital because the private insurance ran out. And at one point, you were at, I guess it's fair to say, your lowest point. Later on, eventually you were taken to a public hospital. And I believe that doctor completely took you off everything cold turkey, right? Because they're going to start fresh.
Yeah. So basically what happened is there was a whole year at that private hospital. I wasn't an inpatient all the time. I kept on being let out. But by the time I was initially let out, because they kept me in for 6 weeks initially, by the time I was out, I was a drug addict or a drug dependent. So it wasn't, I always knew that it was the drugs that was causing it. I just knew. But then I was let out and I couldn't get off them. And every time I tried to skip a dose, I felt awful all the time, but I would feel like so awful that it frightened me. And I was then also very scared that if I didn't take the drugs, that then I would be sectioned again. So I was a sort of, I was just trapped. And so in that year, they put me on pretty much every drug that there was. They gave me every diagnosis: bipolar, treatment-resistant depression, psychotic depression. And it was always, we found the answer now. We've just got to, up the quetiapine, down the Prozac, up the all of this stuff, all of these diagnoses. And I remember there was a turning point when I was given olanzapine, Zyprexa, and that was it. From then on, I couldn't get out of bed at all. It was like somebody had just taken my mind away. Probably I had less akathisia at that time, but it was a whole different journey. But over the course of a year, yes, I was given every drug. There was a time when I was on 7 or 8 different drugs. I was tonic. I put on 4 stone, I'm only 8 stone. And I lost everything. I had tardive dyskinesia by the end of it. So I was dribbling, and that was in the medical notes. It wasn't me saying that was there in the notes. Katinka has tardive dyskinesia, and when I was let out, I couldn't look after myself. I had to have a carer. The money ran out for that, so I was pounding the streets of London with akathisia some of the time when, presumably when the antipsychotics, the sedating of that wore off, the akathisia upped. And so I was in desperation, and I would be pounding the streets of London throughout the night. And then I would do anything just to try and feel better, to try and calm down. So I'd been a teetotaler before and a keep fit fanatic, but I then started drinking. I'd never really drunk before, but I started on my way back at 4:00 in the morning. I was grabbing bottles of whiskey and drinking them just so that I could try and calm down, try and get some sleep. And as well, I've become a chain smoker. I was smoking 70 cigarettes a day, desperately trying to combat the akathisia, the side effects, all of those sorts of things.
Mhm.
So yes, you're right. The thing that saved me, eventually I was finally readmitted into the hospital again after a year. At that point, I'm so ill that I'm on suicide watch. And again, there's now there's signs of psychosis again. It's all in the notes. And then they after 24 hours, they come in and they say, you have to go because the insurance has run out. £50,000 worth of insurance had been spent.
Mm.
So then I'm sent away. And then, yes, I end up in a NHS public hospital, and quite bizarrely, they make an extraordinary decision, which is to take me off all of the drugs,
Which is rare, yeah.
Which is rare and unbelievably foolish as well, unbelievably dangerous to do that. So anyone watching, don't try that at home. I was very lucky to survive, and I only, thank God, I was under section and being protected, not understood, but I was protected there from myself, because I was, I was scratching my skin. I would undoubtedly have taken my life if I'd been out and about, because the withdrawal, the suicidal despair, the akathisia of coming off all of those drugs in one lot was indescribable. They didn't understand what was going on because, as we know, people don't understand the power of these drugs at all. They just thought I was being difficult, actually. But I was screaming. I was screaming for 3 weeks.
Yeah, and then I know you said pretty much as quickly as it came, like you took the dose in the beginning and then you got it practically overnight. After that whole year, it was like one morning you woke up and that was it. It had just gone, and I'm sure it was like the best feeling in the world, just having that totally just clean slate.
It really was extraordinary. It was after 3 or 4 weeks of detox of cold turkey at the hospital, and it really was extraordinary. I just remember waking up one day, and I was just literally, it was overnight. I was okay, and I just looked in the mirror, and I was like, "Who is this person?" And I had this just vague. It was like waking up out of a coma. And I was trying to piece it together. I was like, what has happened in the last year? My kids don't talk to me. Of course, they were terrified. 11 and 12. My mother has gone mad for a year. I've lost my kids. My ex has got the kids. My ex has moved into the home that I was hoping to have. I've not worked for a year. I've, lost my health. I'd, put on a lot of weight. And my face was bloated and my skin had been ripped apart. And I was like, what the hell has happened? And I kind of like just thought back. And I had some kind of clarity. I was like, it all started with that pill that I took. So it was like suddenly my mind was back. And it was like the most extraordinary awakening, because I just knew that I was better then. I just knew it. That there might be sort of little things that were coming back. And actually, over the next few weeks, it was extraordinary as I got my senses back, because of course I hadn't cried for a year. I hadn't laughed for a year. I hadn't been able to read a book for a year. I hadn't been able to watch a film for a year. I hadn't been able to have a conversation for a year. I hadn't really been able to do any exercise for a year. Somehow all of the drugs had taken everything away. And so gradually, whilst I was better, there was still a whole kind of awakening that happened. I remembered the first time I cried, the first time I laughed, the first time I was like, my God, I can read this book. I can focus. I can concentrate. So it was really, really extraordinary. And yes, I came back as quickly as I disappeared, literally overnight. And it was frightening, because there I was in a high security psychiatric hospital. No hope of getting out at that time.
Yeah. And I remember you said, kind of how horrible the experience was being in there, but once the akathisia kind of went away, it was almost like therapeutic for you. It was a sanctuary, because you're kind of there to you're pretty much born again. You're experiencing things for the first time again. And so I assume, yes, once you were released and once everything was pretty much back to normal, I'm sure you hit the ground running in terms of the research you did and everything else you looked up. What was the most interesting or maybe damning thing that you found researching akathisia when you were finally able to really research again?
So when I was in the mental hospital, the psychiatric hospital the last time, and I was better, then the first thing I did was Google antidepressant side effects. And then I came across David Healy, who is well known for his books on the dangers of antidepressants. And I spoke to him, or I can't remember if I spoke to him then, but I certainly spoke to him a few weeks, months later, and possibly emailed him. And so started that research. And I remember saying to him, is it possible that the antidepressants could have caused this with me? And he said, you're lucky that you didn't kill yourself or your children or both. And I remember that really stayed with me. And then around that time, I then started to do the research and realize that there are two ways that cause people to want to take their lives, their own lives, or other people's lives. And there are basically two routes. It's either akathisia or serotonin syndrome. I think I had both of those at different times. I think possibly I had serotonin syndrome when I went into a delirium, but it was certainly mixed up with akathisia as well, because in that delirium, I, remember the agony of akathisia. I remember as well, there was a light bulb moment. This isn't so much about akathisia, but there was a light bulb moment when I read somebody else's account of antidepressant induced psychosis, and it was identical to mine. It was just terrifyingly similar. And I read many other accounts, many people who had killed somebody close to them. And it was the similarities with the psychosis that I had was terrifying. It was all about violence, all about seeing yourself as if looking down, thinking that a feeling of being in a dream or a video game. That was how it was for me. It was like nothing really mattered. So there was that, and then of course the whole thing about akathisia was fascinating to me, because it explained everything that had been going on, the walking around streets at night, the inability to sit still, the agony of it. and the accounts of people who had taken their lives because of akathisia. And it just led me to this, to an absolute passion to tell people about this, because it just became so obvious to me that suicides that were being people were thinking, oh, these people are taking their lives because they're depressed. It became obvious to me that there were a lot of people who were taking their lives because they had akathisia. And the reason I knew it was because I had it. And actually, in much of that year, I remember when I had, mildish akathisia. So not when I was in the kind of like toxic delirium or whatever, but there was throughout that year when I was at the hospital, I just remember so many times just wanting to jump under a train. My mind was sort of thinking, there's no reason for this. I don't have anything really to be depressed about. But it was like I just wanted to end some kind of physical agony, which of course was the akathisia. It really was like there was this voice in my head saying, you've got to end it. And I just know 100% that it was the drugs. I just know that because that voice has never been there before or since. And that feeling of physical agony and wanting to end my life not because of a kind of rational reason of, there was no rational reason for it. I mean, it was frustrating because people, because throughout that time, people were kind of like, well, yeah, no, she's feeling suicidal because, her marriage is broken up and da 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 da. And it was just frustrating because I was like, I didn't give a fuck about that. Before I was fine with that. I had 8 months of being great with that, and I'm still fine with that. The reason that I'm suicidal is because there's something going on with me chemically. There's some kind of chemical alteration that is happening in my body and in my brain, and I have this compulsion to want to jump under a train or jump off a building or do something to end this intolerable feeling that I have. And it's hard to explain to people, and I find it so distressing to hear accounts of people who have taken their lives who had absolutely no history of mental illness. And it's just, to me, quite obvious that, that it was because of akathisia. I have become, I suppose, quite an expert in knowing the signs of a sort of akathisia-induced suicide.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're kind of talking about that chemical imbalance that you had. At what point, I assume when you were doing your research, but at what point did you kind of have that genetic testing done?
So I did that when I was writing. So I wrote a book about my experience, and
Mm-hmm.
that I spoke to one of the researchers who is at the forefront of that, Omar Eichenboom. And so I had the test done then, and yes, I'm a low metabolizer.
It's so much. It's like you've been through so much, and obviously it's such a horrible experience. But it's so interesting in a way. It's like I can imagine after going through all that and coming out of it, you being the journalist you are, it's almost like, wow, there really is something here to tell, and I'm sure before you did the research, part of you was probably thinking, yeah, there's a bunch of people who are going through the exact same thing, because now I've experienced it and now I see that in a totally different way, So did that kind of lead to you? Did that kind of interest in like hearing other stories and getting different perspectives and whatnot lead to you co-founding your website, antidepressantrisks.org?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so there was So I came out of the hospital, and I was sort of, a bit like, Bambi, trying to find my feet, trying to kind of understand all of this and trying to kind of rebuild my life, because at the time, of course, nobody was saying, oh, it's a drug, she's fine now. Everybody was going, she's mentally unstable. And there was a real fear that I would not have my children. And so what was important was getting I very quickly went back to work, didn't tell anybody about what had happened, and got up, rented a house so that my kids would have somewhere for Christmas. And I got my health back very quickly. So I started training for a half marathon, and I became really, really interested in this whole area. And so I went on this journey of discovery and realized that there were many people that had written about this. And so me and my kids went on, we shared the journey together, because they also I wanted them to understand what had happened to their mum. I wanted them to know that it was the drugs, and that there wasn't a chance that I was going to suddenly, become a knife-wielding maniac overnight unless somebody, slipped Prozac into my drink. So that was important to me. And so there were a lot of accounts that I saw, and as well, it was part of my healing as well to meet and talk to some of the people that had gone through this, some of the people that had written books. There was Rebecca Beddoe from Australia who had written a book, Dying for a Cure. And so I was so keen to connect with anybody that had experienced this. And remember, it was at the time really before Facebook groups or whatever. And I remember there was nothing. There was just nothing. There was no support groups. There was David Healy. There were a few experts out there and one or two books. So I gently was putting my story out there on the internet, because I ran a half marathon for David Healy's charity Risk. As a result of that, a few people started coming out of the woodwork and contacting me. And I started to realize that this was, I wasn't the only one. There were more people out there. And I was so determined to get this. I mean, I felt like I knew something that the world had to know, which is that I felt genuinely blessed that when I'd taken that drug, that I hadn't killed my children. I really did. I absolutely knew in my heart of hearts that was could have been a real possibility, that it may have ended very, very differently. That when I had those hallucinations about killing the children and stabbing myself, it could have easily gone the other way. I could have killed them and thought I'd stab myself. It could have gone any way. And also at the time, I became friends with someone who I'm sure you will know, David Carmichael, whose story had ended very differently. So he had had an antidepressant induced psychosis, and he had taken the life of his son, Ian. So I was really aware that this was an issue, that I was very, very lucky that I had this knowledge. Mm-hmm. I was determined to get it out as a documentary. That proved to be very, very hard at the time. So then I decided, to cut a long story short, I wrote my book, effectively. And the book came out, which was then, the research was then bought by the BBC. And then it was eventually made into a documentary, the Panorama, A Prescription for Murder. I had a very good agent who was very brave as well, and a publisher that was very brave to publish the book. And it was heavily legaled. And I got onto a big kind of, it had a lot of publicity. So I got onto ITV's, one of the network's biggest morning programs. And I shared my story. And as a result, I was just inundated with people, inundated. I remember the Daily Mail ran the story. I was just inundated by people to whom the same thing had happened, or people who had lost loved ones, etc., etc.
Wow.
So then I started a website called the pill-that-steals.com, and then I didn't, that changed in lockdown. I just thought, actually, it doesn't really, I needed a title that was more generic and that was more what was on the tin said what it was on the tin, if you see what I mean. And I realized that, I wanted to collaborate with people that were experts, such as David Healy. So I set up Antidepressant Risks. The idea was this, that the main thing that I wanted, of course, there were lots of campaigning organizations and so on. What I wanted to bring to the party was somewhere where people could share their stories. So the centerpiece was the Stolen Lives pages, where people can share the story of somebody that they have loved and lost to antidepressants. And as well, people share their stories of being harmed. So that's the main, that was the main centerpiece, the main idea behind what I wanted to bring to this area, really. And it just expanded from there. I've been blessed with the fact that we now have a team of volunteers, one of whom has assiduously gathered every film known to man on antidepressants. So we have the largest virtual film library of films on antidepressants. And we also do support groups, online support groups, and of course our our in-person event, the Stolen Lives picnics.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know you've had picnics in the past. So what do you have planned for Prescribed Harm Awareness Day this year? I know you have a couple speakers lined up to talk.
So yeah, so basically we had the idea a couple of years ago that just, it would be nice to kind of like gather in a park to have like in-person event. So it started as something really pretty small, and then it really grew last year. So this year is much bigger. So this year we're doing in London, we're doing two things. We're doing the Stolen Lives London Talks, which is a ticketed event in an indoor venue that we've hired. And we have speaking, we have Anders Sorensen, Lucy Johnston, Sammy Tamimi, Martin Kingston, who is the father of Thomas Kingston, who sadly took his life because of an antidepressant. I say because that's what the coroner said. And Catherine Hesseltine, who is a survivor of psychiatric harm. And we have a recorded speech by a member of Parliament and GP, Simon Ofer. We also have a pianist, and so there'll be a sort of remembrance to lives lost. So that's a 2-hour indoor event, and then after that, we will have the picnic that we've had every year. We'll have that in the afternoon, the Stolen Lives picnic, which is on Hampstead Heath. But what we're doing this year is that we have invited people around the world to host their own Stolen Lives picnic. So now we have Stolen Lives picnics in all over the world. So Michigan, Corsica, the Netherlands, Vancouver, Lyon. I'm sure I've forgotten some of them, but anyway, so we're hoping that this will just be the beginning of a global movement, so that every year lives will not be forgotten. So it's the Stolen Lives picnic because we are remembering those who've lost their lives to antidepressant suicide and antidepressant harm, and also crucially, we are honouring people who are currently harmed. Because that is a hidden epidemic. Tragically, people who have been given antidepressants were not warned that in many instances they can cause long-term harm, legacy effects that continue after they've stopped taking them, and all sorts of withdrawal issues and so on and so forth. So as an organization, we are contacted very often by people who are not being supported through this. Their doctors don't understand the harms of these drugs. So they're being told it's all in the mind, that these drugs can't possibly cause these things. The research points to something quite different. So it's a time for people to get together, to offer support for each other, and to come together.
I think it's such a beautiful thing what you're doing and what you created. You know, it's one thing to have these online communities and Facebook groups where people can talk about stuff. That's always great for support, but there's just something different about, I mean, obviously being in person with someone, you know, being able to hear their story and to hug them and to hear all these speakers. I mean, that's such a powerful thing. So that's wonderful. We'll put links below as well to the website, and so people can get more information on that. So if there's anything else that you'd want to talk about in terms of that day or any future projects on the horizon, other forms of journalism or documentaries that you have planned?
You know, I think the main thing, Ivan, is that people have felt so alone in this. People who've lost loved ones to antidepressant harm, people who are currently experiencing debilitating side effects, and they've just had nowhere to turn. And when they've turned to the people they've trusted, their doctors, they have quite often not been understood, and they've not had a voice. And so my greatest wish is that people will feel understood, people will come together at these in-person events, and that this will grow so that people will feel supported, and they won't have to go through this journey alone. So that's, you know, the main thing that we want to do with antidepressant risks, and to collaborate with organizations like yours as well. I mean, you know, the tragic thing is that I speak to doctors and I talk about akathisia. They actually just look at me blankly. There are a lot of doctors who don't know what akathisia is. And if it could be a household name, you know, lives just could be saved. That's the tragic thing.
Yes.
That actually, if people understood what akathisia looks, you know, it's easy to spot, isn't it? If you know what to look out for. So just something to share, and you may not actually want to include this, but I'll say it anyway. But I worked as a volunteer for a charity, a suicide respite charity. So basically it was an inpatient place where people came either for the day or to spend a couple of days because they were suicidal. Somebody came in with absolute, you know, textbook akathisia. And he started, you know, so I could I could tell, because he'd shared that he'd taken a tranquilizer, and as that wore off, you know, he had all of those, you know, he had all of the signs of akathisia. And I said, look, you know, and he started saying that he wanted to kill himself and he couldn't sit still and so on and so forth. And I told the supervisor about it. I said, look, this man, he's got akathisia and he needs emergency care. We need to get him to A&E, whatever. You know, there's no point in actually talking to him and telling him he doesn't, you know, counseling him, asking him why he wants to kill himself. He wants to kill himself because he's got akathisia. I was actually sacked from there. They said, right, sorry, but actually you're not a medic. We don't want you to work here as a volunteer anymore. So, and they had no knowledge of akathisia whatsoever. And this was a sort of quite renowned suicide prevention charity. And a lot of the people, obviously, who come there, they're on medication. They're on medication that causes akathisia.
Yeah.
So education would be so helpful in this regard. You know, people are well-meaning, doctors are well-meaning, but they don't know what akathisia looks like, then they don't have a clue. And because it so mimics anxiety, people really just need a video. They need your video to know what it looks like. because there are perfectly healthy people who take these drugs, have akathisia, end their lives. And it's just, it's absolutely tragic. And there are people, the people who have survived it can actually just can talk about it and can educate. So one of our volunteers had akathisia so badly that she jumped off a building. That's what happened. She survived, but she's perfectly kind of normal now, no mental health issues. She's perfectly okay. These are, this is what the drugs can do. It can turn people who never had any suicidal intent into suicidal overnight. So please continue doing the work that you're doing.
Yes, and you as well. Really, we'll put a link down to your website below, and to the mini documentary as well. I think it's the same name, the pill that what is it? The pill Steals Life. Yes.
It's a family's journey to discover the truth about antidepressants.
Yeah.
So I'll send you the link. And actually, if anyone wants to come to Norway, I'm doing at the Mad in Norway Film Festival. They're showing the film in September, and I'll be visiting and doing a talk there. So
that's great.
Come along.
That's wonderful. That's really good. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today in Akathisia Stories. This has been really insightful and it's great. Really great to hear your story.
Thank you for the work that you're doing.
You've been listening to Akathisia Stories, a podcast from MIST. To learn more and get access to free educational resources, please visit mist.co. Together, we can increase awareness, prevent tragedies, and save lives. At MIST, we are all for truth and disclosure, honesty in reporting, and legitimate drug trials. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.